Alright guys, today we're doing a router comparo, looking at all the basic features of woodworking routers, from plunge base to fixed base, maybe a compact trim router, all the way up to a big behemoth 3 horsepower fixed base router. Look at some of the special features that you can find, like dust collection accessories for your router, and why laminate trim routers are essentially dead in the woodworking market. Stick around, we'll get into it. So if you look at all the types of routers that are available, it can be a little bit daunting, I think, especially if you don't have much experience with routers. Is it a plunge base? Is it a fixed base? Is it a compact router? What's a laminate trimmer? All the way up to the large 3 horsepower industrial type routers. And so figuring out just kind of the basics and which direction to even shoot is sometimes the first step. And for that, you need to think about 2 things. Size of the router, how big of projects do you need to do in terms of the bit size and the power that you'll need from the motor, and also do you need to have a plunge capability. Well, what are the basic differences and types of routers? You've got your fixed base router and your plunge base. These are different brands of mid-size routers in kind of that 2.25 horsepower range is a mid-size router. If you're 3 horsepower or so, that's really a large full-size router. The little guys are in the 1 to 1.25 horsepower for a compact router, and sometimes even less for a trim router. So we'll talk about all of those options, but first let's just divide these into fixed and plunge base. So here's an example of a fixed base router. It's great for doing edge profile work. This is a plunge router, and obviously it's more dynamic. It gives you more options to work with. You can do mortising style cuts with a plunge router, but there are some interesting situations where I would steer clear of a plunge type router. For instance, if I'm using a bearing guided bit, doing some patterning work, you can imagine if you were plunged to depth where the bearing was in contact with your pattern, if that slipped up, if your plunge mechanism let up for just a little bit and the bearing of the bit lost contact with the template, that would ruin your work in dramatic fashion. So with bearing guided bits, I tend to steer towards fixed base routers, but you know, plunge base really opens up a whole new world. You can do inlays with inlay guide bushing kit. Guide bushing is one of the accessories we're going to talk about. Look for another video we'll do on all accessories for routers, but I do want to talk about guide bushings here because it's just such an important accessory to have with any router. So with a fixed base router, you're looking at loosening up the lock and making an adjustment on the base to control your depth of cut. That's a pretty standard operation there. With a plunge base, you release a lever and you have full freedom of movement on the plunge, and that's just limited by a depth rod and turret usually. Most good routers have a depth turret, so you can set multiple settings, but basically loosening this knob, you can lower down the stop block, and you'll be able to plunge within just a fixed range now. So you can predetermine how deep your cut is. Another thing you can look for in any router is whether it's variable speed. This is really key, and if you have a router that has variable speed, it will allow you to use larger bits. Of course, larger bits need to be run at a slower speed. So variable speed is one of the first features you should look for with any router. This is one of the last couple routers I have with fixed speed. It doesn't have that variable speed knob, but that's a compact router, and we'll get into that as we talk about compact routers in a little bit. But if you're choosing just your first router, I would really say go with a combo kit. That'll give you 1 motor and 2 bases. You'll get both a fixed base and a plunge base. And as your shop grows and develops and you need more options to dedicate certain bits to these operations that you do most frequently, I would actually say get an identical combo kit again. So you have two of the same combo kits. That'll give you a lot of flexibility. The motors are interchangeable, and you'll have extra bases that you can dedicate to specialty jigs or just certain operations that you do periodically in the shop. And so it seems like a funny recommendation to get two of the same thing. Most people think as they add a new tool, hey, that should do something entirely different. It should be more powerful or have a different feature. I tend to look at it the other way. If you get all in the same system, it's kind of like cordless drills, you know? You don't want to have 3 different brands of cordless drills. It would be nice to have a couple drills that use the same batteries. They're the same system. I think it's the same for routers. Just pick whatever brand is best for you and kind of stick with that. See if you can get 2 combo kits eventually as your shop develops. So here would be an example of a combo kit. You get a motor, a fixed base, and a plunge base. So you can release the motor from the base, and there's your fixed base. Okay, there's a lot of different things you can do with that. You want to make sure that you have at least one sub base that accepts a guide bushing. Really important if you want to do work with dovetail jig or a certain guided operation that you follow a template but not with a bearing. You can actually follow it with a guide bushing. And then you have the motor itself, power switch, adjustable ring. In this case, there's all sorts of different mechanisms depending on what brand you go with. This one has a removable cord, so you don't have to drag the cord around with you. It just quick releases there. It's a nice way to know that you're detached from power for bit changes and so forth, but certainly not required. This one is variable speed, so you'd have your speed control dial. And again, the larger the bit, the slower you're going to run that. The higher the speed, the more power you get, but also it can limit control with large bits. So there's charts online to figure out how slow you need to turn that for different diameter bits. And then with the plunge base, I think if you have one that's comfortable in your hands and has a relative low center of gravity, those will be the kind of routers that are comfortable for handheld operations. So I want to talk about compact routers because they're really popular in the market right now, and they've all but killed these original laminate trimmers. So this used to be a staple with most woodworkers. They'd have a small laminate trimmer, and now the only people I see using this are people in the construction industry doing countertop installs. They're a little bit smaller and lighter, so you can get into tighter areas, but beyond that, most general woodworkers have switched to compact routers. They've got a lot of great features, and you can even get them in a combo kit. So let's look a little closer at some of the details here. Let's start with a fixed base compact router. What I like about these compact routers is they're really easy to operate. The finger latch that releases the base is easy on the fingers, and it doesn't take much pressure to install or remove a router bit. Some of them even have a quick button that will lock the spindle shaft and just let you make bit changes with one wrench. That's kind of a handy feature. One limitation of the compact routers, of course, is that you can only use 1/4-inch bits, whereas on the bigger mid-size or large routers, you can use 8mm or the bigger 1/2-inch bits, depending on what collets you have available. But basically, if you're looking for a compact router, that's all you're going to be able to use is the smaller 1/4-inch bits. But I mean, just look at how easy these are. They just pop together, and they're really easy on the hands. So this one has a nice feature, and this is something I would look for if I was shopping for a compact router today. Something that has this sub base that's a little bit extended from the edge. And just realize that if you're using a small fixed base compact router, one of the main jobs is just going to be doing round over and light edge profiling work. This one today looks like I have a laminate trim bit in it, but 90% of the time I'll just keep a small 1/8-inch roundover bit in this router, and this is usually kind of my dedicated roundover bit for smoothing furniture parts. And this extended base actually is really helpful for that to add some stability. This base actually came with the DeWalt kit, whereas the motor on this is actually the Porter cable version. So the DeWalt side of the compact routers, they tend to do the little bit upgraded features from the Porter cable. And I know they are kind of phasing out and changing the Porter Cable brand as the years go by, so you'll have to look at the marketplace and see what's available currently. But at the time I bought these, you know, the DeWalt version of this compact router had the variable speed, whereas the Porter Cable version did not. That was a fixed speed router, which is fine if you want to use it for smaller bits like roundovers, and that's great for that application. This can basically become your new laminate router, just with a bit more horsepower. Any of the combo kits for these compact routers can add the plunge mechanism too, and so these are interchangeable just like the larger router kits, and I think it's just a great way to go because it gives you that many more options when you're going about your woodworking. So another class of router is the high horsepower versions. You can get 3 horsepower models in both a fixed base or a plunge base. They're large and they're very heavy. So if you're just doing common woodworking tasks around the shop, this may be a little bit much for your application. I do know some people like to use these motors for a router table, and I think that makes sense because you get the power, but you're not even using the bases that come with the router. Maybe you're using a dedicated router lift. And so that can be a good option, but I don't see as many people using a big 3-horse fixed base or plunge base router in the shop as much. So I think people have gone away from that, and I think it's because of the advent of these mid-size routers. If you have 2.25 horsepower, somewhere in the 11 or 12 amp rating, that's a good place to be. You'll have plenty of power for most operations, and you don't have to drag around all that extra weight. Now, if you don't have a dedicated router lift and you want to have a router that's basically stays put in your router table, you'll be looking for one of these hybrid style routers. They basically have their own router lift built in, and the better ones have features that allow you to adjust things from topside. It's not absolutely critical, but I find it's a lot easier if it comes with a wrench that lets you maybe adjust the bit height or lock and unlock things from the top side. And so it's great to have a little bit heavier, a little bit larger router for the router table application. Typically these are 13 amp routers. If you get up into that 12, 13 amp range, I think that's enough power to be a great router that's dedicated to the router table. Now in these table mounted routers, the ergonomics of the handles and the placement of the power switch become much less critical. I'm not even that worried whether it comes with dust collection. There's so many good aftermarket accessories available that you can easily add on to a table mounted router. It's important to have such a thing, but it doesn't necessarily matter that it comes with it from the factory. If you do want to have a router that's dedicated to a table, really the thing to consider is this base plate. It's a mounting plate that will attach your router to the router table, and you want to make sure that whatever plate you buy is compatible with the brand and model of your router, and variable speed for this sort of router is an absolute must. D-handles, overrated. So let's talk about something really important for all routers, and that's dust collection. You need to consider dust collection when you're shopping for a router. Some of them have really smart designs. This one is a DeWalt. They actually bought the patent from EU routers on how to do through the column dust collection, and it's a really brilliant design and it works quite well. It relies on certain accessories, so you have to have little attachments that go in there for the dust collection to work properly, but it's a good system and it's non-obtrusive. You just hook up your dust collection. If you have a dust extractor or some other way to pull dust from the top of the router, really works good on a plunge base application. Some of these other routers will give you pieces that kind of seem like add-ons. This is a base for the Porter Cable compact router, and it does have kind of this attachment that goes on. It really feels like an afterthought. They're somewhat flimsy. I don't tend to use them. The other reason I don't think they're quite as effective is because with a trim router, you're tending to do edge profiling work. So you're up here, half of the router is hanging off your workpiece. The material wants to spray down here, and we're trying to collect it up here. So if you really are worried about dust collection on a small router just doing roundovers or something, look at some of the aftermarket alternatives there. Likewise, the dust collection options on these compact routers for the plunge-based versions, they tend to be a little bit on the flimsy side. I think in a plunge base, it makes sense. If this was the only router that I had, the compact DeWalt plunge, I think I would invest in one of these little accessories. I got kind of excited by them when they first came out, and so I got all the little accessories, and I can just tell you I don't use these much. If I'm doing something that's really going to generate dust on a mid-size project, I will be using my mid-size routers that have integral dust collection because it really works well, and I don't feel like it's an add-on. There's nothing flimsy that might break just from the weight of the hose. So that's kind of the lowdown on where I stand on dust collection. I do think it's a really important accessory though. So if you can settle on a brand that has done something in terms of dust collection and gives you some options, I think that puts it a notch up from the competition. So what do I recommend you start with? I would definitely go with a combo kit to start if it's your first router. Get something in the mid-size, north of 2 horsepower. If it's 2, 2.25 horsepower, I think you'll be fine for a lot of the woodworking tasks you want to do. Settle on a brand and get a combo kit. Get one that you can do fixed base plus plunge base. Don't worry about expanding the kit to a D base. I don't think you'll use the D handle very often. It's sold because you can get a trigger on the mount, and that has some potential advantages. The main drawback of a D base is they're just really tippy. Unless the bottom of the handle is level with your base, you tend to trust it and it'll tip that little 1/4 inch. I haven't had as good results with the D base handles. So don't worry about spending the extra money on that D base. Go with a basic combo kit that gives you plunge and fixed base. Pick a brand that you think you want to stick with, and when you're ready to expand, get another combo kit of the same brand. I'm telling you, that combination is just invaluable in the wood shop. And then when you are ready to expand your router collection, consider that compact router. They do have some limitations in that they can only take 1/4 inch shank bits, but the advantages they have is they're very lightweight and they're easy to handle. So some things to think about when you're choosing your first router and expanding your collection. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.